over to you, Daniela.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Well, thank you. That was really, really fascinating. I'm going to turn things to a slightly different angle. My project was, I worked on a manuscript best known as Flamenca, which has been studied for really since the 1800s and has actually had quite a bit of scholarship, which is sort of a difference than some of the ones that we've gotten to see so far in these projects. But I was particularly interested in the digital humanities aspects of this course. And I kind of had this contemporary encounter with Flamenca in that I actually found it because I was listening to one of my favorite musical artists who's like a contemporary pop artist, and found that they had based their album off this manuscript. And I thought kind of that intersection of the very contemporary was a very interesting angle to sort of approach this, and that angle itself is actually what raised a lot of questions for me about the manuscript. So in terms of why I found that, that's why I personally found Flamenca, but it's also this text is sort of in this very unique position, a position. Sorry, if you don't mind, I think it's back to the last slide. Perfect. Yeah. Because I'll explain a bit about digital humanities, but Flamenca's in this sort of special position of being brought a bit to kind of more visibility than we might think of other manuscripts. It's kind of gone beyond the purely academic circles. And it's not just been, as you can see from this picture, this is one of the more recent translations. I believe it's a 2020 translation, but it's kind of, people have actually, translators and kind of editors have capitalized on the visibility that this particular album, the Rosalia album, has brought to the manuscript. So it's kind of interesting because it's actually being brought to very public attention because of this music. And so it's sort of in this interesting position where we have new readers encountering a text that is from the 13th century, and it's also in a position in that it's very accessible, which again is sort of a different situation than a lot of the manuscripts we've looked at so far, because it's actually been digitized. So the manuscript itself has been digitized, and then the text itself has also been put in a digital edition that shows the French, English, and Old Occitan edition. And so you can just find it online and read it. And so I was kind of asking myself questions about that. Just to give a little bit of history of the manuscript, it actually has what I would consider a bit of a mutilated history, in the sense that a lot of its folios are missing. Its first folio, which you would have probably found the name of the author as well as the text, is not part of the original manuscript. And so it's been called Flamenca by later translators and editors, and we also just don't know who the author is. It was written in Old Occitan, and it's dated around the 13th century. And in addition to the first missing folio, there's also 4 lacunae throughout the 8,000 or so line long text. And like I said, you can find it digitized via the Bibliothèque de la Ville de Carcassonne, which is where it's currently housed. And when we read the story of Flamenca, it's a typical fins d'amour, which is a courtly love story of the Occitan tradition. And just the general story is that Flamenca is a young, beautiful woman who's married to a nobleman, Archimbos, and he becomes very jealous and imprisons her. And the only kind of pleasure in her life is being able to attend these baths. And another knight hears of her and her plight and arranges to start meeting her at the baths. And then the story ends very inconclusively because of the missing end. But the 3 of them are gathered at a tournament a year after Flamenca has sent Guillaume away because her husband has stopped being jealous. And in terms of its history of translations and editions, it's actually got a pretty long, complicated history and was lost for a period of time. But starting in the 1800s, it was sort of rediscovered and it started being edited and translated. And so today there's translations in French, English, Catalan, Spanish, and Italian to my knowledge, although there may be more. So, and so my broad question kind of going into this was, given all of these editions and translations of Flamenca, and then in particularly in consideration of this sort of displacement that it's had in the digital realm, where it's sort of been, the text itself has been sort of displaced and dislocated from its manuscript origin. I was kind of wondering what a modern day reader, especially one who is very, unfamiliar and not of an academic circle with Flamenca, what they might be reading when they read the Flamenca, and kind of whether this dislocation results in a different interpretation from what we might see across history or in its manuscript. And the next slide, please. And so I thought to explore this problem through digital solutions. And I think, the biggest thing that I came away from using digital applications was that I think the idea of digital humanities can be really scary to humanities students, and particularly for me. I think the first time I heard of it, my thought was like, why would we ever do that? But I think my biggest takeaway has been that digital humanities is really methods that are tools for exploring questions that arise from humanities principles. So it's really just another tool, such as close reading or critical analysis, that we can use to supplement our study of something. And so I had kind of two projects at play that were related. My first one was I wanted to look at the history of editions and translations. What sort of the trajectory has been in editing and translating, as well as what edition of Flamenca we sort of read today when we pick up, the more recent French or English translations. And then I also kind of thought of ways that this question might be aided by literary analysis, because there's quite a expanded field in terms of digital humanities applications for literary analysis, which is something I'll get into. But if we go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about the history of the book kind of aspect of this project. So the way I started thinking about this was I very basically just created a list of all the known editions and translations of Flamenca, and then I went into each of them, and most of them in their prologue listed what edition or what or whether they were based on the manuscript. So if, for example, one had been based on Meillet, which is the sort of earliest French full translation. I found that a lot of them were based on Meillet, who transcribed and edited in French, and who kind of was later corrected by a few scholars. And so I when I came through, doing this, it was just making lists and noting where they were all coming from. And I was working with a corpus of about 20 editions and translations. And the way I thought to represent this and sort of visualize it for myself to take some conclusions away from it was through a very basic network analysis. And network analysis today is it's a pretty commonplace method for analyzing relations between different actors and kind of analyzing the structures that emerge from that. And I think like one example that's totally unrelated to history of the book or anything, but one example of network analysis would be, for example, analyzing relations between social media users in order to kind of understand the spread of misinformation, for example. So it was the same kind of principles that are applied there that I was applying to this smaller corpus, obviously, but a corpus of text to see kind of, and the network itself is, I think, which can be followed through the hyperlink, but we don't necessarily have to go there. It sort of highlights which of the editions and translations are most commonly used, and it also helps visualize this idea of distance between the manuscript and kind of the more recent editions. And so sort of all the nodes directed out of the manuscript show which texts are using that as a base. But as you can see, it's not just the manuscript that's being used for the purposes of translating and editing other texts.
I've just put the link to your visualization in the chat because it's easier for me than switching between the network, and then people can explore it at their own leisure.
Yeah, perfect. And then I think, so for me, this was a really useful way of sort of visualizing what I'd been just charting through lists. But I also hope that it can be a useful tool for a reader considering Flamenca and perhaps what edition to read, and particularly in consideration of, you know, what we might think of as having like a close translation or something that is faithful, because it sort of allows you to see what's being used for what edition or what translation. And then I'll talk about the literary analysis portion if we go to the next slide. So this actually took up kind of like the bulk of my work, just in the sense that I decided I really wanted to dig deep and kind of do some of the coding myself, because what's been really great about digital humanities is that a lot of scholars have put in a lot of time and energy into creating sort of forward-facing computer programs that allow, you know, budding digital scholars to do some quick analysis. And I made use of a lot of those, especially in the beginning, just to sort of get a sense of the text that I was working with. But in the end, I decided to work with RStudio, which is a program in which you use R, which is a programming language. So this actually really gave me a good opportunity to learn some coding and do my own coding in order to sort of perform some of the functions that would be possible on a program created for digital humanities scholars, but also it allowed me to go a little bit further than that. And I'll speak about the sentiment analysis that I did, but that's not something that would really be possible on at least the program that I was using. But really for me, it just kind of gave me sort of a good idea of exactly what was going into all of the analysis I was doing. So the way that I approached this was through what I would call a text mining approach, which is the theory behind it is that you're transforming a body of text into a source of data. So my kind of corpus for this, I did two separate analyses, and I did one on a English translation of Flamenca, which was a Blodgett translation, which is a 1995 translation. So it's one of the more recent ones. And then I also used the Meillet French translation, which the second edition was created in 1932. So that's a little bit older. And but the reason I sort of used these was it was easier because these were the two versions that are available on the Flamenca project, which is this project that I've spoken about that is makes available the text as just digital text online. And so it kind of, I thought that, you know, philosophically it was a useful approach because I was kind of, again, reflecting the practices of a modern day reader by analyzing these two texts, these two corpuses. And so to start with, I took the English corpus and did some text mining, which is really just a technical name for these processes in which you think about a body of text as sort of a set of data. And really, when you do text mining, what you're looking to do is sort of to translate this data into something that you can, perform some tasks in order to, say, find patterns or, find particularities, which is, again, a practice that you would do just as a humanities scholar, except at this point, using a digital tool, you're doing it more, you're doing it on a larger scale, and you're thinking about it more as data. And so the way that this starts is I had to write some code, but eventually I was able to sort of break down the text into line fragments, word fragments, and section fragments that I sort of designated myself. And then this allowed me to do some pretty basic functions. As you will see on the left, this is just a graph, a visualization of the code that I ran to get just basically the word frequencies and the most appearing words. So in English, we can see that, the most frequently appearing words are love and William, which is a translation for Guillaume, who is the second knight who comes into play, lady, sir, heart, flamenca. And then in French, they're very similar, but in slightly different order. So Guillaume, who's, again, Guillaume's, and then amour, flamenca, dame. And so, you see some similarities here, but also another thing that's notable is that there's a lot more words in English just in general, as in there's a higher English density of words, but that's actually just because at first I sort of took that as, oh, this is interesting, but I had to sort of ground myself again and remember that the French text is actually in verse, whereas the English one is in prose, so it actually makes sense that this word density is being reflected here. And so this kind of gave me a few, ideas, but one thing that I was really interested in doing, and again, kind of the reason I decided to work with a programming language versus, a forward-facing program, was because what I wanted to do was run sentiment analysis, which is sort of another, new digital method that actually gets used often in marketing, in terms of it's useful because you can take, for example, a bunch of reviews of a product online and then run the sentiment analysis across, hundreds of thousands of reviews. And then it'll sort of tell you, were they positive or were they negative, which, a computer can do in seconds and would take, a human many, 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 many weeks to go through. And then I don't even know if you'd kind of have a broad picture. So what this is sort of doing again is just taking these words and this text and treating it as a set of data, and then giving you sort of a big picture, like looking at it kind of from a bird's eye view sort of perspective. And the reason I was sort of decided to do this sentiment analysis was just in general, I was curious about it, but also my original thought had been that it'd be very interesting to compare the sentiments of different editions and translations in order to see if, maybe if the more recent translations, for example, might give us, a more positive reading of flamenca. Because I think that there are some questions in terms of how we as readers read this text, particularly because, as I've said, it is a text, it is a fin amours, it's a courtly love story. But there's some aspects that are clearly negative, not only the jealousy, but there's also, what was interesting to me in my close reading was that there's also some scenes of serious suffering by Flamenca, and I was sort of curious whether those got reflected broadly in the text or if that was sort of left out. And so this graph that you can see in the center, what it's pointing to, these are three actually, the way you run sentiment analysis is by applying a lexicon, which is it's a human created list of words, which are then ranked or rated as positive or negative. And you take that list and you cross it with the text that you're trying to analyze, and then you get, these graphs eventually once you run the code to visualize them. But sorry, one second. So the reason I have 3 here is because I decided to use 3 different lexicons. So it's, 3 different scholars who have put together their own list of words, given them a positive or negative rating, and then made them available, for public use in order to do this kind of function. And so, one thing that's immediately clear is that they're not exactly the same at all. You can see that the third one largely rates everything more positive than the first 2. But the first 2 are pretty close, particularly in just the sense of, how many or what aspects sort of turn, because you can see the quick shifts between positive and negative, and those are pretty well reflected across all 3, but especially the first 2. And I found this interesting because, the way I was able to approach this following this analysis was, and one thing that sentiment analysis is particularly useful for when looking at a literary text is to kind of look at the extremes or look at these areas of, of a quick switch from positive to negative, and then going in and doing some close reading and analysis there. And Flamenca is, 8,000 lines, so it's not an extremely long text, but, if you were reading, say, War and Peace or something, and you wanted to sort of maybe see points of extreme polarization or tension, this would be a really good process if you wanted to get kind of that big picture idea. But the other thing, of course, that I was doing the whole time that I was running this analysis was sort of considering the limitations of doing, again, such a thing on a literary text. And so I've included on the right a picture of another code and another program I performed on the text, which was to find the words that make up the majority of the sentiment. So, for example, I think the reason that it's clear that you can see why Flamenca overall just ranks so positively is because the word that makes up the sentiment, or the word love, which we already saw appears so frequently in the text, is also one that contributes highly to positive sentiment ratings, and therefore, because of its just sheer frequency, the text is actually rated overall very positively. So this kind of allowed me to see which words of the lexicons were ranking highly, either negatively or positively, and which ones were most impacting the sentiment analysis, which was an important insight because, of course, we have to be aware of what words, we have to be aware of the process behind, our analysis and be aware of the limitations, which again is sort of a reason why I wanted to run this on my own versus using a forward-facing program. But it was kind of an interesting analysis in the end. And another limitation that I ran across was, as I mentioned, I had wanted to do this across different editions and translations. But one thing that was difficult about that is the actual fact that there aren't very many lexicons that have been built, because of course it takes a lot of power to do that, a lot of effort to put together, sort of this enormous word bank and then rank the words. And so I could only find one in English and French, which made it so that, I was applying them to the English and French versions of these texts. But it would be interesting to see it, in Catalan or in Spanish and see how that ranked. And it does raise, again, another question about limitations, about just really whether at the end of the day we're ranking these sentiments or we're even, drawing conclusions about this language. But overall, just the process of doing it allowed me to, get a better sense of flamenca, see what words make us read it in a certain way, and then, be able to see it sort of visualized like this, and then go into specific sections and analyze those and do some close reading, which is, a very humanities-based English critical practice. And so in terms of conclusions, I think I've named a few of them. But one thing I kept returning to was that, going back to my original question of what we read today when we read flamenca, one of my conclusions was actually that there is a real need to, for me at least, kind of these digital explorations confirmed for me the importance of the materiality and of the manuscript as a medium for reading a text, and kind of attuning ourselves to that. It really signaled for me kind of the significance of that as an epistemological process, particularly because I also, I didn't get to see the manuscript with my own eyes, and I suppose none of us really did because of COVID, but particularly me, I knew from the beginning that I was approaching this by just looking at the digitized version of this manuscript. But what I was really drawn to in that manuscript were not just the way that the lacuna kind of created meaning for the text, either by sort of omitting or, leaving some points unsaid and leaving some silences and open spaces, but also there were quite a few interesting annotations by earlier readers, and it sort of made me pay attention to those portions of the text, and that's not something that can just be seen when you read a text on a screen. And so that was kind of my personal conclusion about this process. And at the same time, I also really got to learn a lot about sort of the ways forward for digital humanities, as well as the limitations, and how to kind of go about solving humanities-based close reading questions, and doing them with digital applications. So thanks very much, and thank you to everyone who was really helpful in this project, because it was definitely quite the exploration and a lot of learning. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Fascinating also to see it, to expand really our understanding of what can be done with the humanities project. And I really like the juxtaposition of today's talk, and I would encourage all of you to come back for the final workshop that we'll be doing, where we'll try to really get together these different approaches and to see. I think Daniela, the journalist, will be able to learn some of the methods of mining further the edition in German, and vice versa, how to deal with Marginalia, for example. So I stop recording